The coma patient in the ICU hadn't moved in 3 years, but Nurse Sarah noticed his wounds healed impossibly fast. Everyone thought he was just another John Doe, but when she accidentally cut herself during his bath, his nostrils flared and his fingers twitched. She'd been caring for the vampire king, and now he was waking up hungry. Sarah Martinez checked her watch as she pushed through the heavy doors of St. Helena Medical Center's ICU ward, the familiar antiseptic smell mixing with something else she could never quite identify, something that seemed to cling to the air around room 237. 3:15 a.m. glowed on the digital display as she made her way down the dimly lit corridor, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the polished linoleum. The night shift had become her sanctuary after graduating nursing school 18 months ago, a deliberate choice to avoid the political minefields and territorial disputes that plagued the day staff, leaving her free to focus on what drew her to medicine in the first place: the quiet moments of caring for those who couldn't care for themselves. Her small apartment across town felt empty most evenings anyway, filled only with medical textbooks and the occasional takeout container, so the hospital's hushed atmosphere provided a strange comfort that her own home never could. She paused outside room 237, her hand resting on the cool metal door handle, as she prepared for her nightly ritual with the patient she'd privately named Adrian, though his chart still read John Doe after 3 years of mysterious silence. The man lying motionless in the hospital bed had been found unconscious in Millfield Woods during one of the worst lightning storms in the county's recorded history, his body discovered at the exact center of a perfect circle where multiple lightning strikes had charred the earth black. No identification, no missing person reports, no anxious family members calling the hospital daily for updates, just an impossibly beautiful man who appeared to be in his early 30s with pale skin that seemed carved from marble and dark hair that grew at a normal rate despite his catatonic state. Sarah had read his admission notes countless times, memorizing every detail of that strange October night when the paramedics found him without a single burn mark, despite being surrounded by lightning damage. His vital signs so weak they barely registered, yet somehow stable enough to sustain life. The doctors had run every test imaginable during his first year, searching for brain trauma, toxicology results, any medical explanation for his condition. But the scans showed a perfectly healthy brain with no signs of damage or disease. His body maintained muscle tone without physical therapy. His hair and nails grew normally. His skin remained unmarked by bed sores despite 3 years of immobility, as if time moved differently around him while he slept. Sarah entered the room and felt the familiar drop-in temperature that she'd noticed from her very first shift, a coolness that seemed to emanate from the patient himself rather than any malfunction in the hospital's climate control system. She spoke to him softly as she always did, updating him on her day, the weather, small observations about the other patients that she would never share with anyone else. "Good evening, Adrian," she whispered, checking his IV lines and monitors with practiced efficiency. "I brought Keats tonight. I thought you might like the Eve of St. Agnes. There's something about the imagery that seems to suit you." She had developed this intimate routine over months of caring for him, reading poetry during the quiet hours between medication rounds, bathing his skin with gentle thoroughness, trimming his hair when it grew too long, speaking to him as if he might respond at any moment. His skin felt different under her touch than any other patient she'd cared for, not quite cold but lacking the warmth of living flesh, smooth and flawless in a way that defied medical explanation. The other nurses avoided lengthy stays in his room, claiming the electronics acted strangely, monitors flickering, IV pumps beeping error codes that reset themselves before anyone could investigate. But Sarah found herself drawn to these peculiarities, rather than repelled by them. She maintained a private notebook separate from his official medical records, documenting observations that seemed too strange to include in clinical notes that other staff might read. IV puncture sites healed overnight without scarring. Surgical incisions from his initial emergency surgery had faded to nothing within weeks. Minor cuts from blood draws closed so quickly that she sometimes questioned whether she'd imagined them. Tonight she planned to change the dressing on a small wound where his central line had been recently repositioned, a procedure that should leave visible marks for days on any normal patient. She gathered her supplies with methodical care, laying out gauze, antiseptic, and medical tape on the bedside table while continuing her one-sided conversation about the book she'd brought. The scalpel felt familiar in her hand as she carefully cut away the old bandages, but something made her pause, a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere that she couldn't quite identify. Her hand trembled slightly as she worked, perhaps from too much caffeine, or the strange energy that always seemed to fill the space around his bed, and the blade slipped against her palm, opening a clean cut that immediately welled with bright red blood. The reaction was instantaneous and impossible to ignore. His nostrils flared with the first voluntary movement she'd witnessed in 3 years of caring for him, a subtle but definite expansion, as if he were drawing in a deep breath. His fingers twitched against the white hospital sheets, not the random muscle spasms that sometimes occurred in coma patients, but a deliberate movement that made her heart race with excitement and terror. She pressed a gauze pad against her cut, watching his face intently for any other signs of awareness. But he had returned to the same peaceful expression she knew so well. Sarah bandaged her wound with shaking hands, her mind racing through the implications of what she'd just witnessed. But as she prepared to clean the area around his central line, she noticed something that made her freeze completely. A single drop of her blood had landed on his lips during her moment of distraction, and those lips were moving with the faintest suggestion of pressure, as if he were tasting something precious. Sarah spent the remainder of her shift documenting every detail of the incident in her private notebook, recording the exact time, the environmental conditions, her own physical state, anything that might explain what she'd observed. She reviewed the security footage from the hallway cameras, hoping to capture some external evidence of the patient's movement, but discovered that the electronic systems had malfunctioned during the precise minutes when his response occurred, leaving only static where clear images should have been. The phenomenon wasn't unprecedented in room 237, but the timing felt too convenient to be coincidental, as if something were deliberately obscuring evidence of his awareness. She should report the neurological activity to the attending physician immediately, following standard protocol for any change in a long-term coma patient's condition. But something deep in her intuition warned against involving the hospital's bureaucracy in whatever was happening between them. The feeling wasn't logical or professional, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty, as if exposing this development would somehow put him in danger she couldn't yet understand. During her lunch break, Sarah found herself in the hospital's medical library, searching through old newspaper archives for any details about the night Adrian was found. The local paper had covered the storm extensively, describing it as an unprecedented meteorological event, with lightning strikes concentrated in patterns that defied scientific explanation. Multiple witnesses reported strange sounds coming from Millfield Woods, described variously as music, screaming, or voices speaking in languages no one recognized. But these accounts were buried in later editions as the story focused on property damage and power outages. The police reports were frustratingly sparse, mentioning only that an unidentified male had been discovered unconscious and transported to St. Helena Medical Center. But Sarah noticed discrepancies in the timeline that suggested important details had been omitted or deliberately obscured. One report mentioned that the responding officers had requested backup, but the supplemental reports were classified or missing from the public records, leaving her with more questions than answers about the circumstances surrounding his arrival. Sarah began staying overtime after her regular shift ended, bringing books from her personal collection to test his responses to different types of literature. She read him Shakespeare and noticed the slight raise of an eyebrow during particularly dramatic passages, shared terrible nursing school jokes that earned her what she swore was a subtle smile, experimented with different genres and authors to map the boundaries of his awareness. The responses were never obvious enough for anyone else to notice, micro-expressions that could be dismissed as wishful thinking, or the natural variations in muscle tone that occurred in unconscious patients. But she was becoming convinced that some part of him was listening and responding to her presence. Her voice grew more confident during these sessions, sharing details about her life that she'd never told anyone, her fears about making mistakes with other patients, her loneliness in the city where she knew no one outside of work, her growing attachment to a man whose name she didn't even know. The breakthrough came during a night when she'd chosen to read Dracula aloud, selecting the novel partly as a joke about his pale complexion and partly because she'd always loved Gothic literature. She was reading Van Helsing's first description of vampires when she heard it, soft as a whisper but unmistakably real, her own name spoken in a voice like aged whiskey and midnight shadows. Sarah. The word hung in the air between them, impossible and undeniable, carrying an intimacy that made her heart race with emotions she couldn't identify. She had never introduced herself officially, never spoken her name during their one-sided conversations, yet somehow he knew her, had been listening and storing away details during months of what she'd believed were solitary vigils. She sat frozen beside his bed, staring at his peaceful face, waiting for him to speak again. But the moment had passed as quietly as it had come. The strange occurrences began escalating after that first whispered word, subtle changes that she might have dismissed individually, but that formed a pattern when considered together. Patients in nearby rooms reported unusually vivid nightmares, always involving shadowy figures and the taste of metal, dreams so disturbing that several requested room transfers. The hospital's blood bank began showing minor inventory discrepancies, small amounts that could be explained by clerical errors or expired units, but the pattern repeated weekly with mathematical precision. Night security guards started requesting transfers to other shifts or buildings, citing equipment malfunctions and an atmosphere that made them uncomfortable, though none could articulate exactly what bothered them about the ICU's night environment. His skin grew noticeably warmer under her touch, his pulse stronger when she checked it manually. Yet the electronic monitors continued displaying the same flat-lined readings they'd shown for 3 years as if the machines were recording a different patient entirely. Sarah arrived for her shift one December evening to find something that stopped her completely in the doorway of room 237. A single black rose lay on his bedside table, its petals perfect and fresh despite the impossibility of its presence. She checked with the day nurse, reviewed visitor logs, questioned night security about anyone who might have entered the room, but found no record of how the flower had arrived. The security cameras showed nothing but empty hallways during the hours before her shift, no florists or family members, no staff carrying flowers through the ICU. Black roses didn't grow naturally, requiring special cultivation and care, and certainly couldn't bloom in December's frozen landscape outside the hospital windows. She lifted the flower carefully, noting its unusual fragrance and the way its stem had been cut with precision, as if someone with extensive knowledge of horticulture had prepared it specifically for this moment. As she placed it in a makeshift vase beside his bed, she noticed his breathing had changed, becoming deeper and more regular. And for just a moment, she could have sworn she saw his eyes moving beneath their closed lids, as if he were dreaming of something beautiful and terrible at the same time. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Dr. Helena Voss arrived at St. Helena Medical Center on a Tuesday morning in January, her credentials impeccable, and her interest in the hospital's long-term coma patients unusually intense for someone of her stature in the neurological community. Sarah first encountered the new head of neurology during a staff meeting where Dr. Voss announced her intention to review all cases involving unexplained unconsciousness, her pale blue eyes lingering on Sarah with an attention that felt both calculating and predatory. Within days of her arrival, Dr. Voss had requested comprehensive files on every patient in the ICU, but she seemed particularly fascinated by the John Doe in room 237, ordering a battery of new tests that hadn't been performed in over 2 years. Sarah felt an immediate and inexplicable resistance to these developments, an instinct that warned her against allowing this woman anywhere near Adrian, though she couldn't articulate why the doctor's interest felt so threatening. When the orders came down for new MRI scans, blood work, and experimental neurological assessments, Sarah began finding creative ways to delay their implementation, citing scheduling conflicts with other departments, equipment malfunctions that required extensive repairs, and patient care priorities that took precedence over research protocols. The delays bought her time to establish a more sophisticated communication system with Adrian, whose responses had grown increasingly deliberate and complex since their first whispered exchange. She discovered that he could move his eyes in patterns that corresponded to letters, spelling out words with painstaking precision during their late-night conversations when no other staff members were present. The process was exhausting for both of them, requiring intense concentration and patience, but it opened a window into his consciousness that revealed the depth of his awareness during the 3 years she'd believed him unconscious. "Your voice," he spelled out during one of their early attempts at conversation, "kept me anchored when I wanted to drift away. Your touch was the only warmth in the darkness." The revelation that he'd been conscious throughout his apparent coma, aware of every word she'd spoken, every gentle caress as she'd cared for his body, filled her with a mixture of wonder and embarrassment that made her reassess every moment they'd shared. Through their laborious communication system, Adrian began revealing fragments of a world that existed parallel to her own, a supernatural community with its own laws, hierarchies, and conflicts that most humans never suspected. His coma wasn't medical, but mystical, he explained, a magical imprisonment designed to keep him unconscious and powerless, while others maneuvered for control of territories and resources he'd once commanded. The concept challenged everything Sarah understood about medicine and reality, but the evidence was undeniable when she considered the anomalies she'd documented over the years, the impossible healing, the electronic malfunctions, the way his presence seemed to alter the very atmosphere around him. "Others coming," he warned her one night, his eyes moving with urgent precision as he spelled out each letter. "Danger you." The cryptic message filled her with anxiety, but before she could ask for clarification, footsteps in the hallway forced her to resume her normal nursing routine, leaving his warning hanging between them like a sword. Dr. Voss's true nature began revealing itself through overheard conversations and behavioral patterns that struck Sarah as increasingly unnatural. Late one evening, while organizing supplies in a storage room adjacent to the doctor's temporary office, Sarah heard her speaking on the phone in what sounded like multiple languages, her voice taking on cadences and inflections that seemed almost inhuman. "The sleeping king grows restless," she said in accented English that carried undertones Sarah couldn't identify. "3 years of waiting, and now the barriers weaken. We must act before the blood bond completes itself." The words made no immediate sense, but they resonated with the fragments Adrian had shared about his imprisonment and the supernatural forces that had orchestrated his condition. Sarah began paying closer attention to Dr. Voss's movements throughout the hospital, noting how security cameras seemed to malfunction in her presence, how other staff members appeared uncomfortable around her without being able to explain their unease, how electronic equipment behaved erratically whenever she examined patients. The confrontation came at 4 in the morning during what should have been Sarah's routine medication round, when she discovered Dr. Voss in room 237 with a syringe connected to Adrian's IV line, muttering words in a language that sounded like Latin, mixed with something much older and more sinister. Sarah's entry interrupted the injection mid-procedure, causing Dr. Voss to spin around with an expression of fury that transformed her usually composed features into something predatory and inhuman. "This is a new experimental treatment Dr. Voss said, her voice carrying an authority that seemed designed to discourage questions, but her explanation felt hollow and rehearsed. Sarah noticed that Adrian's face was contorted in obvious distress for the first time since she'd known him, his body rigid with tension and his breathing labored in a way that registered on the monitors as the first significant vital sign changes in 3 years. The substance in the syringe glowed with a faint luminescence that definitely wasn't characteristic of any medication Sarah recognized from her pharmaceutical training, and the smell in the room had changed to something metallic and organic that made her stomach turn. Marcus Webb had worked night security at St. Helena Medical Center for 15 years, and Sarah had always appreciated his quiet competence and the way he seemed to genuinely care about the patient's well-being, rather than simply walking through his rounds with bureaucratic indifference. She hadn't expected him to approach her the following evening with knowledge that suggested he'd been observing the situation in room 237 with the same careful attention she'd been giving it. "I've seen things in this hospital that don't fit in medical textbooks," he said, his weathered face serious in the dim hallway lighting. "That patient of yours isn't the first one to attract unusual attention from visitors who don't show up on security cameras." Marcus explained that the hospital had been built on land that local indigenous communities had considered sacred burial grounds. And while most staff dismissed the historical background as irrelevant superstition, he'd noticed patterns over the years that suggested something more significant was at work. Certain patients drew visits from individuals who moved through the building without triggering electronic security systems, people whose presence seemed to alter the behavior of both technology and staff members in ways that defied rational explanation. Through Marcus's connections and observations, Sarah learned about a hidden network of humans who were aware of the supernatural community's existence, some serving as protectors and allies, while others functioned as hunters and adversaries in an ongoing conflict that most people never suspected was happening around them. The knowledge was both liberating and terrifying, confirming her instincts about the strange events she'd witnessed while revealing how dangerous her involvement had become. Marcus had been part of the protective network for years, using his position in hospital security to shield vulnerable supernatural beings from those who would exploit or harm them. And he recognized in Dr. Voss the signs of someone who served the darker aspects of this hidden world. "She's not here to help your patient," he warned Sarah. "She's here to make sure he never wakes up. And anyone who's been caring for him is probably considered a liability that needs to be eliminated." Adrian's communication grew more urgent and detailed as Dr. Voss's presence in the hospital intensified, revealing a personal history that explained why his imprisonment had been so carefully orchestrated and maintained. "Not just vampire," he spelled out during one of their lengthy conversations. "Royalty. Kingdom vulnerable without king." The revelation that he was vampire royalty transformed her understanding of the forces arrayed against them, suggesting that his awakening would trigger political consequences far beyond the personal relationship they'd developed. His enforced sleep had created a power vacuum that others were exploiting, and his return to consciousness would threaten established arrangements that had persisted for 3 years. Through their communication system, he revealed that Dr. Voss represented a faction that included both supernatural beings and human collaborators, who benefited from keeping him imprisoned, a conspiracy that viewed his progressive policies regarding human-vampire relations as dangerous to their traditional power structures. The real conspiracy centered on preventing a potential civil war within vampire society, but not for altruistic reasons, as Adrian's continued communication revealed the complex political situation his imprisonment had been designed to address. His faction had been working toward greater integration with human society, developing policies that would have reduced the secrecy and predatory relationships that had characterized vampire-human interactions for centuries. But powerful conservative elements within his own kingdom viewed these changes as existential threats to vampire supremacy. Dr. Voss and her allies had orchestrated his mystical imprisonment as a temporary solution that would allow them to restructure vampire society according to their own vision, but Adrian's awakening threatened to undo years of careful manipulation and return power to someone whose values conflicted with their goals. The injection she'd administered wasn't designed to help him recover, but to deepen his unconscious state and make his imprisonment permanent, eliminating the possibility of his return to power. Sarah faced a choice that would determine not only Adrian's fate, but her own survival, as he made clear. Through their communication system, that helping him would mark her as a target for forces far more dangerous than hospital politics or medical review boards. "Leave now," he spelled out with obvious difficulty, the effort of communication taking a visible toll on his strength. "Danger for you grows." But Sarah had already made her decision during the weeks of caring for him, developing feelings that transcended professional duty and personal safety. And she told him through whispered words and gentle touches that she wouldn't abandon him regardless of the consequences. Her choice seemed to strengthen something in him, his responses becoming more animated and his physical presence in the room more noticeable, as if her commitment was breaking down barriers that had kept him trapped between consciousness and oblivion. Their planning session the following night was interrupted by a power failure that plunged the entire hospital into darkness. But this wasn't the usual electrical malfunction that occasionally affected medical facilities during winter storms. The darkness felt deliberate and malevolent, accompanied by sounds that had no place in a modern hospital, whispers in languages that predated English, footsteps that moved through hallways with inhuman rhythm and purpose. Through the windows of room 237, Sarah saw shapes moving across the hospital grounds, silhouettes that seemed to flow rather than walk, their forms shifting and changing in ways that challenged her understanding of anatomy and physics. Marcus's voice came through her radio with unusual tension, reporting multiple security breaches by individuals who appeared and disappeared without triggering any electronic detection systems. And she realized that whatever forces had been keeping Adrian imprisoned were making their final move to ensure his continued unconsciousness. The shapes outside grew larger and more numerous as they approached the hospital building, and Adrian's eyes opened fully for the first time in her presence, glowing with an otherworldly light that transformed his face from peaceful to predatory, revealing the supernatural nature he'd been hiding beneath his human appearance during their months of gentle interaction. The hospital's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows when Adrian's eyes opened completely for the first time in Sarah's presence, revealing irises that glowed with silver fire and a consciousness that was fully awake and utterly inhuman. The transformation began slowly, his features sharpening as dormant predatory instincts awakened after 3 years of forced slumber, and Sarah watched in fascination rather than fear as his canine teeth elongated into fangs that gleamed like polished ivory in the crimson darkness. She stumbled backward as the magnitude of what she was witnessing overwhelmed her. But before she could fall, Adrian moved with impossible speed that defied the laws of physics, his arm encircling her waist with strength that could have crushed her ribs, yet held her with infinite gentleness. The touch sent electricity through her nervous system, awakening senses she didn't know she possessed, and she found herself staring into eyes that held centuries of knowledge and pain, alongside something tender and protective that was focused entirely on her. His voice when he spoke was no longer the whispered fragments she'd grown accustomed to, but rich and commanding, with an accent that spoke of old European nobility and power that had shaped nations through careful manipulation and strategic patience. The attack came through the hospital's main entrances and service corridors simultaneously, as figures in medical scrubs moved through the darkened hallways with coordination that suggested military training and supernatural abilities that made them far more dangerous than any human assault team. Sarah recognized some of them as staff members she'd worked alongside for months, their familiar faces now revealing the predatory nature they'd hidden beneath professional competence and friendly collegiality. Dr. Voss led the group that entered room 237, no longer bothering to maintain her human disguise as her features shifted into something reptilian and ancient, her hands extending claws that could tear through steel, and her voice carrying harmonics that seemed designed to induce paralysis in her victims. She carried syringes filled with the same glowing substance Sarah had interrupted her administering earlier, But now there were multiple doses that she clearly intended to inject directly into Adrian's heart to ensure his permanent unconsciousness. The other creatures with her moved to surround the bed, cutting off escape routes while preparing restraints that looked more like torture devices than medical equipment, their eyes reflecting the emergency lighting with the cold calculation of predators who had finally cornered their prey. Adrian's response revealed the lethal grace that had made him a king among creatures who were themselves apex predators, his weakened state from 3 years of imprisonment doing nothing to diminish the deadly efficiency with which he moved to protect Sarah from threats that could have killed her before she realized she was in danger. He flowed rather than stepped, his movements so fluid they seemed choreographed, and the first attacker died before making a sound as Adrian's hand passed through his chest with surgical precision. The smell of blood filled the air as he engaged multiple opponents simultaneously, turning their superior numbers against them by using their own momentum to redirect attacks back toward their allies. Sarah watched him fight with the detached fascination of someone witnessing something both beautiful and terrible. Understanding for the first time that the gentle patient she'd cared for possessed the capacity for violence that had been honed over centuries of survival in a world where mercy was often interpreted as weakness. His fangs weren't just for feeding, but weapons designed for combat, his speed allowing him to strike and retreat before his enemies could react, his strength enabling him to tear through supernatural flesh as easily as paper despite his recently awakened state. Marcus appeared in the doorway with weapons that definitely weren't standard security equipment, firing what looked like modified tranquilizer darts that caused the attacking creatures to dissolve into ash upon impact, clearing a path toward the service corridors that would allow them to escape the hospital without encountering the main force of Dr. Voss's allies. Adrian lifted Sarah with effortless strength, carrying her through passages she'd never known existed beneath the medical center, his supernatural senses allowing him to navigate the darkness while avoiding the search parties that were systematically checking every room and storage area. The tunnels smelled of age and dampness, connecting the hospital to a network of underground spaces that Marcus explained had been part of the original building's design, created by architects who understood that certain patients might require discrete transportation methods that avoided public scrutiny. They emerged through a maintenance exit several blocks from the hospital, where Marcus had positioned a vehicle that would take them to a safe house he'd prepared for exactly this type of emergency, though he admitted he'd never expected to use it for someone of Adrian's apparent importance to the supernatural community. The apartment above Webb's Rare Books occupied the entire third floor of a building that had been constructed in the 1920s with architectural features that Marcus explained served practical as well as aesthetic purposes. The iron fixtures and specific geometric patterns in the woodwork, designed to interfere with supernatural tracking abilities and provide protection against various forms of mystical surveillance. Sarah found herself in a space that felt like a cross between a library and a fortress, with books covering every available wall surface and symbols carved into door frames that seemed to pulse with their own internal energy. Adrian moved through the rooms with obvious recognition, suggesting that he was familiar with this type of warding and the networks of humans who provided sanctuary for supernatural beings who found themselves in conflict with their own kind. Marcus prepared tea with herbs that filled the air with scents Sarah couldn't identify, explaining that certain plants had properties that helped accelerate healing and recovery for beings whose physiology operated according to different rules than human biology. Adrian's revelation of his complete identity transformed everything Sarah thought she understood about the man she'd been caring for, as he explained that his full name was Adrian Blackthorne, and he was the legitimate ruler of vampire territories that encompassed most of North America. Position he'd inherited through bloodlines that traced back to the original vampire courts of medieval Europe. His imprisonment hadn't been the random act of supernatural criminals, but a carefully orchestrated political coup designed by a council of conservative vampires who opposed his policies regarding integration with human society and his attempts to modernize relationships between the species. The 3 years of his enforced unconsciousness had allowed his enemies to consolidate power, while his loyal followers were eliminated or forced into hiding, creating a situation where his return would face immediate opposition from entrenched interests that had benefited from his absence. The scale of the conspiracy was staggering, involving not just vampire nobility, but human collaborators in governments and institutions who preferred the traditional arrangements that kept supernatural communities hidden and controllable through carefully managed fear and misinformation. The larger conflict that his awakening would trigger wasn't simply about vampire politics, but about the future relationship between human and supernatural worlds, as his progressive policies had been moving toward eventual disclosure and integration that would fundamentally alter the balance of power that had existed for centuries. His enemies preferred the current system where vampires operated as apex predators, with humans as an unwitting prey species, maintaining their dominance through secrecy and selective culling that prevented human populations from recognizing the extent of supernatural influence in their societies. Adrian's vision involved gradual revelation and cooperation, establishing frameworks for coexistence that would benefit both species while reducing the violence and exploitation that characterized current arrangements. His absence had emboldened conservative factions, who were now implementing policies designed to increase vampire dominance while eliminating any possibility of peaceful integration, creating a situation where his return was essential to prevent a genocide that would claim millions of human lives. Sarah discovered that her prolonged exposure to Adrian's awakening power, combined with the blood connection established when she'd accidentally cut herself in his presence weeks earlier, was beginning to affect her own physiology in ways that were subtle but increasingly noticeable. Her senses had sharpened to the point where she could hear conversations through walls and detect emotional states through scent. Her healing rate had accelerated dramatically, so that the cut on her palm had vanished without scarring, and her stamina had increased to levels that allowed her to function without sleep for extended periods. Adrian explained that she was undergoing a partial transformation that fell short of actual vampirism, but enhanced her human capabilities in ways that would prove essential if she chose to remain involved in his world. The changes weren't permanent at this stage and could be reversed if she decided to return to normal human life, but they were progressing toward a threshold where she would need to make a definitive choice about her future. The message from Adrian's lieutenant arrived through channels that Marcus had established for emergency communications with supernatural networks, delivered by a raven whose intelligence clearly exceeded normal avian capabilities, and whose ability to locate them despite the apartment's protective wards suggested connections to magic that Sarah was only beginning to understand. The news was catastrophic in its implications, revealing that Adrian's capital city was under siege by forces loyal to the council that had imprisoned him. His remaining followers were dying in battles they couldn't win without their king's leadership, and the political structure of vampire society was collapsing into civil war that would inevitably spill over into human populations. The timeline was critical. As his lieutenant estimated, they had 72 hours before the capital's defenses would fail completely, allowing his enemies to claim legitimacy through occupation of his traditional seat of power, and eliminating any possibility of restoring his rightful rule through political rather than military means. Adrian struggled with the weight of kingship that his awakening had restored, torn between his responsibility to subjects who were dying for their loyalty to him and his desire to protect Sarah from dangers that would increase exponentially if she accompanied him back to his kingdom. The 3 years of imprisonment had given him perspective on what truly mattered in existence, and his feelings for the human woman who had cared for him during his most vulnerable period had grown into something deeper than political alliance or supernatural obsession. Sarah insisted on helping despite his attempts to convince her that returning to his world would put her in mortal danger, revealing strength and resourcefulness that impressed him while demonstrating her determination to see their relationship through to whatever conclusion awaited them. Her medical knowledge had already proven valuable in treating injuries that conventional vampire healing couldn't address, and her unique position as someone who existed partially in both worlds made her an asset that could prove decisive in the coming conflict. Their planning sessions involved coordinating with Adrian's remaining loyal forces through communication networks that operated outside normal technological channels, using methods that combined traditional espionage techniques with supernatural abilities that allowed instantaneous contact across vast distances. Sarah learned about vampire politics and ancient laws that governed relationships between different supernatural species, understanding for the first time the delicate balance that prevented open warfare between creatures whose individual capabilities far exceeded human limitations. Adrian explained that returning to full power would require him to embrace aspects of his vampire nature that he'd been suppressing, making him more dangerous and less human in ways that might fundamentally alter their relationship. The price of reclaiming his throne involved accepting the predatory instincts that came with his species, and he warned Sarah that the man she'd grown to care for might become someone she wouldn't recognize once he fully resumed his role as vampire king. Their emotional connection deepened as they prepared for what might be their final days together, Adrian admitting that he'd fallen in love with the human who had shown him kindness during his most helpless state, while Sarah acknowledged that her feelings had evolved far beyond professional duty or even personal affection into something that transcended the boundaries between their species. She proved herself capable of handling the supernatural world's demands by successfully treating wounded vampires whose injuries required knowledge of both human anatomy and supernatural physiology, using her medical training in ways that no textbook had prepared her for, but that somehow felt natural, given her enhanced abilities and growing understanding of how magic and science could complement each other. The discovery that Dr. Voss had been working for Adrian's brother Prince Victor added personal betrayal to the political conspiracy, revealing that the council's actions were motivated not just by ideological opposition to Adrian's policies, but by familial ambition that sought to claim his throne through elimination rather than legitimate succession. Victor's plan involved using Adrian's absence to wage war on human populations, implementing policies designed to establish overt vampire dominance while eliminating any possibility of the integration that Adrian had been working toward. The moral stakes of their mission became clear as they realized that Adrian's return wasn't just about reclaiming power, but about preventing a genocide that would destroy the careful balance between worlds that had prevented open supernatural warfare for centuries. Victor's forces tracked them to Marcus's apartment through methods that overcame even the building's protective wards, and during the attack that followed, Marcus was captured, while Sarah faced a choice between her own safety and her commitment to helping Adrian save his kingdom and prevent the catastrophe that his brother's rule would inevitably trigger. Victor's stronghold occupied a converted cathedral in the mountains outside the city, its Gothic architecture serving both aesthetic and practical purposes, as the stone construction and consecrated ground provided natural defenses against certain types of supernatural attack, while the building's original sacred nature had been corrupted through rituals that transformed it into a fortress of darkness. Sarah and Adrian approached through forests that seemed unnaturally quiet, the normal sounds of wildlife absent in a way that suggested the presence of predators far more dangerous than any natural ecosystem could support. Adrian moved with the fluid grace she'd witnessed during their escape from the hospital, but now his supernatural abilities were fully awakened and directed toward infiltration rather than defense, his senses allowing him to detect guard positions and patrol patterns that would have been invisible to human perception. Sarah discovered that her connection to Adrian had evolved beyond the partial transformation she'd experienced earlier, granting her temporary abilities that included night vision sharp enough to distinguish individual leaves in complete darkness, enhanced strength that allowed her to climb surfaces that should have been impossible for human physiology, and a supernatural sense that let her detect the presence of other vampires through some combination of scent, electromagnetic fields, and mystical resonance that she couldn't fully understand, but had learned to trust completely. The rescue mission required them to navigate through multiple layers of security that combined traditional physical barriers with supernatural wards designed to prevent exactly the type of infiltration they were attempting. But Adrian's knowledge of vampire stronghold construction and Sarah's medical training proved to be an unexpectedly effective combination. She identified weak points in the building's structure by recognizing architectural features that corresponded to pressure points in anatomy, understanding that buildings constructed by vampires would reflect the same principles of vulnerability and strength that governed their physical forms. Marcus was being held in the cathedral's crypt, a location chosen not just for its security, but for its symbolic significance, as Victor sought to demonstrate his power over the humans who had allied themselves with Adrian's progressive policies. The rescue itself required Sarah to use her enhanced abilities in ways that pushed them beyond their normal limits, her body adapting to supernatural demands that should have killed a normal human, but that her connection to Adrian somehow made not just possible, but natural. The confrontation between the brothers took place in the cathedral's main sanctuary, a space that had been transformed from its original sacred purpose into an arena where Victor had planned to execute Marcus publicly as a demonstration of what happened to humans who interfered with vampire politics. Adrian entered with the authority of a rightful king reclaiming his throne. But Victor's 3 years of preparation had given him advantages that made the physical confrontation only one aspect of a battle that was fundamentally about competing philosophies regarding the relationship between vampires and humans. Victor had grown stronger during Adrian's absence, feeding regularly and without restraint while building alliances with conservative vampire factions who shared his belief that their species' natural superiority should be expressed through domination rather than cooperation. The battle that followed combined supernatural speed and strength with political maneuvering, each brother seeking not just to defeat the other physically, but to prove that his vision for vampire society represented the path forward that would ensure their species' survival and prosperity. Sarah's crucial intervention came when she recognized that Victor's apparent invincibility stemmed from his ability to heal from wounds that would have been fatal to other vampires. But her medical knowledge allowed her to identify the source of this advantage as a centuries-old injury that had healed improperly and created a supernatural scar tissue that actually enhanced his regenerative abilities while creating a specific vulnerability that could be exploited by someone who understood both anatomy and vampire physiology. The wound had been inflicted during a duel fought in medieval times, and Victor had used dark magic to accelerate his healing in ways that created dependencies on the same mystical energies that now powered his enhanced abilities. Sarah's understanding of how trauma affected both physical and supernatural healing processes enabled her to guide Adrian's attacks toward the precise location where Victor's magical enhancements created a cascade failure that would neutralize his advantages and restore the balance between the brothers' natural abilities. Victor's revelation of his motivations transformed the conflict from a simple succession dispute into a fundamental philosophical debate about the nature of vampire society and its relationship with humanity, as he explained that he had orchestrated Adrian's imprisonment specifically because his brother's love for humans represented an existential threat to vampire supremacy that would eventually lead to their species' extinction through integration and compromise. Victor believed that vampires' natural advantages made them the rightful rulers of Earth, and that Adrian's policies of coexistence would inevitably result in vampires losing their edge through complacency and interbreeding that would dilute their supernatural abilities over generations. His vision involved open conquest rather than hidden manipulation, establishing vampire dominance through displays of power that would reduce humans to a managed food source, while eliminating any possibility of the equality that Adrian's progressive policies had been moving toward. The arrival of the supernatural tribunal interrupted the brothers' battle at its climax. As representatives from the various species that governed supernatural politics materialized in the cathedral with authority that transcended individual vampire politics and demanded resolution of conflicts that threatened the stability of the entire supernatural world. The tribunal included ancient vampires whose age and power dwarfed both Adrian and Victor, werewolf pack leaders whose territories bordered vampire domains, fey nobility whose magical abilities made them arbiters of supernatural law, and other beings whose very presence altered the atmosphere in the cathedral, and made it clear that this confrontation had implications far beyond the succession dispute that had triggered it. Sarah found herself in the unprecedented position of being a human witness to supernatural justice, her presence both an anomaly that the tribunal had to address and a test case that would determine how human involvement in vampire politics would be handled in future conflicts. The test that the tribunal imposed required Sarah to demonstrate that the coexistence Adrian advocated was actually possible by performing an act of trust that would prove humans and vampires could form genuine partnerships rather than simply predator-prey relationships disguised as cooperation. She had to allow Adrian to feed from her in front of the supernatural court, not just the brief contact that had established their initial connection, but a full feeding that would restore his strength to its maximum levels while demonstrating that she trusted him completely, despite knowing that vampire feeding could easily become fatal if the vampire lost control. The ritual aspect of the feeding was as important as its practical effects, as it served as a public declaration that their relationship transcended species boundaries and represented a new model for supernatural human interaction that could serve as a precedent for future policies. The transformation scene that followed became something far more profound than simple feeding, as Sarah's willing participation and Adrian's careful control combined to create a mystical bond that enhanced both of their abilities while demonstrating to the tribunal that cooperation between species could create synergies that benefited both parties rather than simply allowing one to exploit the other. Sarah experienced the feeding not as victimization but as communion, sharing not just her blood, but her life force in ways that strengthened Adrian while awakening abilities within herself that she had never suspected were possible. The supernatural court witnessed their mutual transformation with the same attention they would give to the signing of treaties or the establishment of new laws, understanding that they were observing the creation of a new type of relationship that would influence supernatural politics for generations to come. Adrian's restoration to full power through Sarah's willing sacrifice gave him the strength needed to defeat Victor decisively, but his choice to spare his brother's life rather than executing him demonstrated the mercy and wisdom that the tribunal had been evaluating as qualifications for leadership. Victor's defeat wasn't just physical but philosophical, as Adrian's demonstration of restraint proved that strength could be combined with compassion in ways that made rulers more effective rather than weaker. The supernatural court observed this display of mercy as evidence that Adrian's progressive policies stemmed not from weakness or naivety, but from a sophisticated understanding of power that recognized cooperation as more sustainable than domination in the long term. The tribunal's acceptance of Adrian's right to rule came with conditions that reflected their recognition of the unprecedented nature of his relationship with Sarah and the implications it would have for future supernatural governance. They acknowledged that his policies of integration and coexistence had merit and could be implemented on a trial basis, but they demanded guarantees that human involvement in vampire politics would be carefully regulated to prevent the chaos that could result from premature exposure of supernatural society to broader human awareness. Sarah's role in the conflict had proven that humans could be valuable allies rather than simply prey or obstacles, but it had also demonstrated that human involvement would require careful management to prevent conflicts that neither species was prepared to handle. The price that the tribunal demanded for their recognition of Adrian's legitimacy forced Sarah to confront the full implications of her relationship with him and her growing involvement in the supernatural world, as they made clear that her knowledge and abilities now made her too dangerous to return to normal human society, but too valuable to eliminate. She had to choose between having her memories altered so that she could resume her previous life as a nurse with no recollection of vampires or supernatural politics, or accepting a permanent place in Adrian's world with all the responsibilities and dangers that such a position would entail. The choice wasn't just personal, but political, as her decision would influence how the tribunal approached future cases involving human supernatural relationships, and would either validate or undermine Adrian's entire philosophy of integration and cooperation. The supernatural court made clear that this decision had to be made immediately and would be irreversible, forcing Sarah to weigh her love for Adrian against her attachment to her human identity, while understanding that her choice would affect not just her own future, but the future of human-vampire relations throughout North America. The supernatural tribunal's ultimatum hung in the cathedral's transformed sanctuary, like a sword suspended over Sarah's future, their ancient voices explaining with implacable logic that her knowledge of vampire politics and supernatural society had made her too dangerous to exist in the human world, yet too valuable to simply eliminate through the traditional methods used to silence inconvenient witnesses. She must choose complete integration into Adrian's world, with all the transformations and responsibilities that such a choice would entail, or submit to memory alteration that would erase every moment of their relationship and return her to her previous life as a night shift nurse who would never again wonder about the strange patient in room 237. The tribunal's representatives made clear that this wasn't simply a matter of personal preference, but a question of supernatural security, as Sarah's partial transformation and intimate knowledge of vampire weaknesses made her either a powerful ally or a devastating threat, depending on how her loyalties ultimately aligned themselves. Adrian's torment was visible in every line of his face as he struggled with wanting to influence her decision, while recognizing that true choice required her to reach her conclusion without pressure from the man she loved, knowing that asking her to choose him meant asking her to sacrifice everything she had been before they met. His centuries of existence had taught him that love extracted prices that weren't always apparent until after they had been paid. And his feelings for Sarah were complicated by his understanding of what joining his world would cost her in terms of the normal human life she had worked so hard to build for herself. He wanted to tell her that her happiness mattered more to him than his own political future or even his kingdom's survival, but the weight of responsibility for his subjects' lives prevented him from speaking words that might influence her decision in ways that served his desires rather than her best interests. Sarah's deliberation took place in the quiet moments between supernatural crises, as she mentally catalogued everything she would be leaving behind if she chose to join Adrian's world permanently, rather than returning to the human existence she had known before discovering his true nature. Her career as a nurse had given her purpose and identity for years, representing not just professional achievement, but her commitment to healing and caring for others in their most vulnerable moments. Her small apartment across town from the hospital contained books she'd collected since college, photographs of family members who lived in distant states, mementos of a life that had been ordinary but meaningful in ways she was only now learning to appreciate. Her humanity itself was at stake, not just the biological aspects, but the worldview and experiences that had shaped her into the person Adrian had fallen in love with. And she wondered whether the enhanced abilities and extended lifespan that came with supernatural integration would fundamentally alter her identity in ways that would make her unrecognizable to herself. Their return to St. Helena Medical Center felt like visiting a museum of her former life, as Sarah walked through corridors that had once felt like home, but now seemed strangely small and limited after her exposure to the vast supernatural world that existed parallel to human society. She tied up loose ends with the efficiency of someone who understood that this might be her last opportunity to interact with her previous existence, submitting paperwork for an extended leave of absence that could become permanent resignation depending on her final decision. Her colleagues noticed changes in her that they attributed to stress or personal issues, unaware that they were observing the early stages of a transformation that would either be completed or reversed within days, depending on choices that would affect far more than her individual future. Dr. Voss's fate served as both justice and warning, as the supernatural tribunal's representatives administered their own form of correction for her betrayal of medical ethics and abuse of her position to harm patients under her care. The corrupt doctor's memories were selectively altered to remove all knowledge of the supernatural world while leaving her medical training intact, ensuring that she could continue practicing medicine but would never again be able to threaten supernatural beings who sought treatment in human medical facilities. The process was described to Sarah as painless but irreversible, a clinical procedure that would eliminate Dr. Voss as a threat while preserving her value as a trained physician. And Sarah found herself both relieved by the justice and disturbed by the casual efficiency with which the tribunal manipulated human consciousness to serve supernatural interests. Marcus's choice to accept a position in Adrian's court as a human liaison represented both personal loyalty and professional evolution, as his years of protecting supernatural beings through his security work had prepared him for a role that would formalize his involvement while expanding his ability to facilitate cooperation between human and supernatural communities. His network of contacts and understanding of how both worlds operated made him invaluable for implementing the integration policies that Adrian wanted to pursue, and his decision to fully commit to the supernatural world provided Sarah with an example of how humans could find purpose and identity within vampire society without losing their essential humanity. Sarah's decision emerged from her recognition that her feelings for Adrian were inseparable from her desire to use her medical knowledge to help supernatural beings who had been denied proper health care due to the segregation that had kept their communities hidden from human medical institutions. She chose love and the supernatural world, but on terms that would allow her to contribute something meaningful rather than simply accepting a role as Adrian's consort or political decoration. Her proposal to establish a medical facility where humans and supernatural beings could be treated together represented an ambitious fusion of her professional expertise with the integration philosophy that had attracted her to Adrian in the first place, offering a practical application of coexistence that would benefit both communities while creating precedents for future cooperation. The binding ritual that would link Sarah permanently to Adrian's world required preparation that combined ancient supernatural traditions with modern understanding of consent and partnership, as the tribunal insisted that her transformation be conducted according to protocols that would ensure her humanity remained intact, even as her abilities and lifespan were enhanced to supernatural levels. The ceremony took place in a location that had been consecrated for such purposes, with witnesses from multiple supernatural species present to validate the legitimacy of a union that would have political implications far beyond its personal significance. Sarah felt the mystical energies beginning to alter her cellular structure in ways that enhanced her existing capabilities while awakening latent potentials that had been dormant throughout her human life. But the process was interrupted when Victor's remaining supporters launched their final attack during the most vulnerable phase of the transformation. The attack disrupted the binding ceremony at precisely the moment when Sarah's transformation was half completed, leaving her caught between human and supernatural states, in ways that made her more powerful than she had ever been, but also more vulnerable to the mystical forces that were now competing for control of her altered physiology. Her partially transformed state gave her abilities that exceeded both human and vampire norms in some areas, while creating instabilities that could prove fatal if the ritual wasn't completed within a limited time frame. The attackers had timed their assault to maximize the damage they could inflict, not just on Adrian's political position, but on Sarah personally, understanding that her incomplete transformation would either force Adrian to choose between completing her conversion under combat conditions or losing her to the mystical contradictions that were already beginning to tear at her enhanced but unstable biology. Sarah's condition in the aftermath of the interrupted ritual manifested as unpredictable surges of supernatural abilities that she couldn't control, combined with physical symptoms that suggested her human biology was struggling to accommodate the magical energies that had been partially integrated into her cellular structure. Her lifespan had been shortened rather than extended by the incomplete transformation, as the opposing forces within her enhanced physiology created a cascade effect that would prove fatal unless the binding ceremony could be completed under proper conditions within a time frame that was measured in days rather than weeks or months. The symptoms included sensory overload, as her enhanced perceptions fluctuated wildly, strength that varied unpredictably from superhuman to dangerously weak, and mystical awareness that allowed her to sense supernatural presences, but also exposed her to psychic interference from hostile entities who recognized her vulnerability. Victor's loyalists pursued them through a campaign that combined traditional hunting techniques with supernatural tracking abilities, seeking to eliminate both Adrian and Sarah before they could complete the bond that would not only save her life, but also establish the precedent for human-vampire cooperation that threatened the conservative vampire faction's vision of species dominance. The pursuit took them through urban environments where the supernatural conflict played out against the backdrop of normal human activity, forcing them to maintain secrecy while fighting for their lives against enemies who had fewer constraints about collateral damage. The underground network of humans who protected supernatural secrets proved essential to their survival, providing safe houses and resources that allowed them to stay ahead of their pursuers while searching for a location where the binding ritual could be completed under conditions that would ensure Sarah's survival. Marcus's leadership of the Human Protection Network revealed the extent to which cooperation between species had already been developing beneath the surface of official supernatural policy. As he coordinated resources and personnel that included humans who had formed personal relationships with supernatural beings, as well as those who simply believed that coexistence was preferable to the alternatives of conflict or ignorance. Sarah's growing power, despite her unstable condition, made her invaluable in the conflict, as her unique abilities allowed her to sense both human and supernatural presences in ways that neither species could achieve individually, making her an early warning system that kept them ahead of their pursuers while also serving as a bridge between the human and supernatural members of their alliance. The final stronghold they chose for their last stand was St. Helena Medical Center itself, which Marcus revealed had been built on a supernatural nexus that made it an ideal location for completing mystical rituals while also serving as a symbolic return to the place where Sarah and Adrian's relationship had begun. The hospital's construction on ancient burial grounds hadn't been coincidental but deliberate, as the architects had understood that medical facilities built on such locations would be particularly effective for treating supernatural beings whose physiology responded to the mystical energies that accumulated around sites of spiritual significance. Room 237 became the focal point for completing the interrupted ritual, as the location where Adrian had spent 3 years in magical imprisonment contained residual energies that could be redirected towards stabilizing Sarah's transformation if they could control the environment long enough to complete the ceremony. The true battle that developed around the hospital transcended vampire politics to become a conflict about the fundamental relationship between human and supernatural worlds, as supporters and opponents of integration chose sides based on their vision of how the two communities should interact in the future. Sarah's innovation of proposing a medical facility where humans and supernatural beings could be treated together had attracted allies from both sides who recognized the practical benefits of cooperation, but it had also galvanized opposition from those who viewed any form of integration as a threat to their traditional power structures. The alliance building that resulted from her proposal brought together former enemies who found common ground in supporting a model of coexistence that offered practical benefits to all parties involved. Victor's arrival with his final gambit transformed the conflict into a test of whether supernatural society was prepared to risk exposure to the broader human world rather than accept the changes that Adrian and Sarah represented, as he threatened to reveal the existence of vampires, werewolves, and other supernatural beings to human authorities unless Adrian abdicated his throne and abandoned his integration policies. The threat wasn't empty, as Victor had prepared extensive documentation and evidence that would force human governments to acknowledge the supernatural world's existence while framing that revelation in terms that would promote fear and conflict rather than cooperation, understanding that chaos would serve his political interests better than the peaceful coexistence that his brother advocated. Victor's ultimatum reverberated through the supernatural community with the force of a declaration of war, as he made clear that his willingness to expose vampire existence to the human world wasn't a bluff, but a calculated strategy designed to force a choice between his vision of supernatural dominance and what he characterized as Adrian's naive dream of peaceful coexistence. The threat was delivered through channels that reached every major supernatural leader across North America, explaining that he had compiled 3 years' worth of evidence, including video footage, medical records, and documented supernatural incidents that would prove beyond any doubt that vampires, werewolves, and other creatures had been living among humans for centuries. Victor's plan was elegant in its brutality, as he understood that exposure would initially trigger human fear and aggression that would justify supernatural retaliation, creating a cycle of violence that would eliminate any possibility of the integration that Adrian advocated while establishing Victor's faction as the strong leadership that supernatural communities would need to survive the coming war. Sarah's analysis of Victor's strategy revealed the fatal flaw that his obsession with vampire supremacy had blinded him to, as she recognized that exposure would indeed destroy both worlds, but not in the way he anticipated, since human technological and military capabilities had evolved far beyond what they had been during previous periods of supernatural human conflict. Modern weapons, surveillance systems, and global communication networks meant that exposure would lead not to vampire dominance, but to mutual destruction, as humans would respond to the revelation of supernatural threats with industrial-scale warfare that would eliminate supernatural communities while also destroying the human institutions and infrastructure that both species depended upon for survival. Her medical training had taught her to think systematically about cause and effect, and she understood that Victor's plan would trigger cascading failures in both human and supernatural society that would leave neither world intact. The broadcast began at midnight across multiple networks simultaneously, as Victor's supporters infiltrated television stations, internet platforms, and emergency broadcast systems to ensure maximum penetration of his revelation to human populations throughout North America. The evidence he presented was undeniable and terrifying, showing security footage of supernatural beings demonstrating impossible speed and strength, medical records documenting patients with physiology that defied human norms, and testimony from humans who had been involved in supernatural incidents but had previously been dismissed as delusional or attention-seeking. The immediate response was exactly what Victor had anticipated, as panic spread through human communities, while supernatural beings either went into hiding or prepared for the conflict they knew was inevitable once their existence became public knowledge. Adrian's willingness to sacrifice his throne and accept exile, rather than allow Victor's plan to destroy both worlds, demonstrated the nobility that had made him worthy of kingship. But it also revealed his failure to understand that abdication wouldn't solve the fundamental problem that Victor's exposure had created. Sarah recognized that her unique position as someone who existed between both worlds gave her perspectives and options that neither brother had considered, and she began implementing a strategy that would require her to risk everything she had gained while drawing upon every skill she had developed during her transformation from human nurse to supernatural ally. Her plan was dangerous precisely because it required her to trust that both human and supernatural communities contained enough wisdom and compassion to choose cooperation over conflict when presented with alternatives to the fear-based narratives that Victor was promoting. Sarah's counter-revelation utilized the same broadcast systems that Victor had compromised. But instead of presenting supernatural beings as threats to be feared and eliminated, she used her medical credentials and her documented experience caring for supernatural patients to frame the revelation in terms of healthcare needs and scientific opportunity rather than existential conflict. Her broadcast showed footage from the integrated medical facility she had been developing, demonstrating supernatural beings receiving treatment for injuries and illnesses while working alongside human medical staff in ways that highlighted their similarities rather than their differences. She spoke directly to human fears about supernatural predation by explaining the complex nutritional and social needs that drove behaviors that appeared threatening but could be managed through cooperation and understanding rather than violence. The public response to Sarah's alternative presentation began shifting human opinion from immediate panic toward cautious curiosity, as her medical authority and documented experience provided credibility that Victor's fear-mongering couldn't match. Healthcare professionals began coming forward with their own experiences treating patients whose physiology had seemed unusual but explicable, while researchers expressed interest in studying supernatural biology for insights that could benefit both human and supernatural medicine. Sarah's framing of supernatural revelation as a medical and scientific opportunity rather than an existential threat created space for rational discourse that Victor's approach had been designed to prevent, and her emphasis on documented cooperation between species provided evidence that coexistence was not only possible but already happening in limited contexts. The supernatural community's response to exposure was complicated by their recognition that Victor's plan had eliminated the option of returning to secrecy, forcing leaders from all supernatural species to choose between supporting Adrian's integration model or Victor's separatism, while understanding that neutrality was no longer possible. Werewolf pack leaders, Fey nobility, and other supernatural authorities found themselves having to take public positions on human supernatural relations for the first time in centuries, with their choices influenced by Sarah's demonstration that exposure could lead to cooperation rather than conflict if managed properly. The debate within supernatural communities revealed fundamental philosophical divisions that had been simmering beneath the surface for generations, as progressive and conservative factions argued about whether their species' long-term survival depended on dominance or partnership with human society. Marcus's network of human protectors chose this moment to reveal themselves publicly, providing evidence that cooperation between humans and supernatural beings had been developing for generations through the efforts of individuals who had chosen to bridge the gap between communities, rather than maintaining the separation that both sides had traditionally preferred. Their testimonials provided concrete examples of successful human supernatural partnerships in areas ranging from medicine and research to law enforcement and military service, demonstrating that Victor's assumptions about inevitable conflict were based on outdated models of species interaction that ignored the evolution of both human and supernatural society over the past century. The supernatural parliament that convened to choose between the brothers' competing visions represented the most comprehensive gathering of supernatural leadership in North American history, as species that had traditionally maintained separate territories and independent governance structures recognized that exposure required coordinated responses that transcended individual community interests. The vote that would determine whether Adrian or Victor would lead vampire society would also establish precedents for how all supernatural communities would relate to human society in the post-exposure era, making the outcome relevant to werewolves, fae, and other beings whose futures would be shaped by the policies that emerged from this conflict. The debate preceding the vote revealed the complexity of issues that had been simplified by both brothers' public positions, as delegates raised concerns about everything from economic integration to interspecies reproduction to the legal frameworks that would govern supernatural human interactions. Victor's final desperate move invoked an ancient vampire law that had been designed to settle succession disputes through single combat when political processes failed to produce clear resolution, challenging Adrian to ritual combat where the winner would take absolute authority over vampire society while the loser would face execution or permanent exile. The challenge couldn't be refused without Adrian forfeiting his claim to leadership, and Victor had timed it to interrupt the parliamentary vote at the moment when his political position was weakening due to the success of Sarah's alternative narrative about supernatural human relations. The ritual combat would be witnessed by representatives of all supernatural species, making its outcome binding not just for vampire society, but for the broader supernatural community that would have to work with whoever emerged as the legitimate vampire king. Sarah's role in the ritual combat was determined by ancient laws that designated the combatants' chosen mates as mystical anchors whose survival was linked to their partner's legitimacy as leaders, meaning that if Sarah died during the combat, Adrian would automatically lose regardless of his performance against Victor. The system had been designed to ensure that vampire kings considered the broader implications of their conflicts rather than simply pursuing personal vendettas, but it also meant that Sarah would be as much a target as Adrian during the fighting that was about to take place. Victor's supporters had prepared for this possibility by positioning themselves to attack Sarah while Victor engaged Adrian, understanding that eliminating her would be easier than defeating Adrian in direct combat and would achieve the same political objectives with less risk to their chosen leader. Victor's cheating became apparent immediately as the ritual combat began, as he deployed human technology including electronic jamming devices and chemical weapons alongside supernatural allies who violated the single combat tradition by providing assistance that the ancient laws had been designed to prevent. His strategy revealed the fundamental dishonesty of his position regarding supernatural superiority, as he was willing to use human innovations to gain advantages over his brother, while simultaneously arguing that vampires should dominate humanity through their natural abilities. The combination of technological and mystical cheating created advantages that threatened to overwhelm Adrian despite his superior combat skills and political legitimacy, forcing Sarah to intervene in ways that would risk her life while potentially saving both their futures. The hospital environment provided strategic advantages that neither brother had fully anticipated, as Sarah's intimate knowledge of St. Helena Medical Center's layout and systems allowed her to guide Adrian through areas where his familiarity with the building would give him advantages over Victor's superior preparation and numerical support. The medical equipment and pharmaceutical supplies available throughout the facility could be weaponized or used defensively in ways that required knowledge of both human medicine and vampire physiology, giving Sarah opportunities to level the playing field through interventions that drew upon her unique expertise in treating supernatural patients. Room 237 became the focal point of the combat as both brothers recognized that the mystical energies concentrated in the location where Adrian had been imprisoned could be harnessed to enhance their abilities, while also providing the neutral ground that ritual combat required. Sarah's medical intervention proved decisive when she used her detailed knowledge of vampire physiology to identify vulnerabilities in Victor's enhanced abilities that could be exploited through precise application of pharmaceuticals and medical procedures that would have been impossible without her background in both human medicine and supernatural anatomy. Her understanding of how vampire regeneration worked allowed her to develop countermeasures for Victor's healing abilities, while her knowledge of their enhanced metabolism enabled her to calculate dosages of substances that would affect vampire physiology without causing permanent damage. The intervention required her to risk her life by getting close enough to Victor to administer treatments while Adrian was engaged in direct combat, but her success in neutralizing Victor's advantages demonstrated the practical benefits of the human supernatural cooperation that Adrian's policies advocated. The turning point in the ritual combat came when Adrian realized that defeating Victor through pure violence would validate his brother's argument that vampire nature was fundamentally predatory and incompatible with peaceful coexistence, forcing him to find ways to win the combat while demonstrating the mercy and restraint that would prove his fitness for leadership in an integrated world. Adrian's strategy shifted from trying to kill Victor to trying to exhaust his enhanced abilities while demonstrating to the supernatural witnesses that strength could be combined with compassion in ways that made leaders more effective rather than weaker. The approach required him to accept greater risks and endure more damage than necessary for simple victory, but it served the larger purpose of proving that his philosophy of integration was compatible with the strength that vampire society required from its leaders. Victor's apparent acceptance of defeat masked his activation of a device that had been hidden within the hospital's infrastructure during the months of preparation leading up to this confrontation, a weapon designed to destroy the entire medical center and everyone within it, rather than allow Adrian to claim victory and implement his integration policies. The device combined human explosives with supernatural energies that would ensure complete destruction while creating the appearance of a terrorist attack that would discredit any possibility of peaceful, supernatural human relations, making Victor's final act one of spite that would eliminate both brothers while ensuring that his vision of separation and conflict would be the only option remaining for supernatural society in the post-exposure world. Victor's final weapon represented the culmination of 3 years of planning and preparation, designed not simply to kill his enemies, but to discredit the entire concept of supernatural human cooperation. By creating an explosion that would combine human technology with supernatural energies in ways that would make the hospital's destruction appear to be a terrorist attack targeting medical facilities. The device had been carefully engineered to leave forensic evidence that would point toward extremist groups rather than supernatural involvement, ensuring that any survivors who might speak about vampires or other creatures would be dismissed as trauma victims whose accounts couldn't be trusted by investigators or the media. Victor's strategy was elegant in its cruelty, as he understood that dying as a martyr while destroying Adrian's vision of integration would serve his political goals even more effectively than victory in ritual combat, since it would eliminate the possibility of peaceful coexistence while ensuring that his conservative allies would inherit leadership of vampire society by default. Sarah's recognition of the device's operating principles came from her medical training in cardiac emergency procedures, as she realized that Victor's weapon was essentially an amplified version of the defibrillation technology used to restart stopped hearts, but scaled up to supernatural proportions that would channel mystical energies through the hospital's electrical systems in ways that would overload every piece of electronic equipment while simultaneously triggering structural failures that would bring down the entire building. Her understanding of both human technology and supernatural physiology allowed her to grasp what Victor had failed to consider in his design, namely, that the device's energy output could theoretically be absorbed and redirected by someone with the right combination of human knowledge and supernatural abilities, though such an intervention would require precise timing and would almost certainly prove fatal to whoever attempted it. The impossible choice that confronted them in the moments before Victor's device reached critical activation levels was complicated by the specific requirements for stopping the explosion, as the absorption process would require someone to serve as a living capacitor for energies that exceeded human biological tolerances, while simultaneously possessing enough understanding of the underlying technology to redirect the power flow away from the hospital's structural systems. A normal human would be instantly killed by exposure to the mystical energies involved, while a full vampire would lack the technological interface capabilities needed to interact with the device's human-designed control systems, leaving only someone with Sarah's unique combination of partial supernatural transformation and medical expertise as potentially capable of the intervention that would save everyone in the hospital. Adrian's attempt to sacrifice himself by absorbing the device's energy was prevented by the limitations imposed by Sarah's incomplete transformation ritual, as the mystical bond between them meant that her partially transformed state created resonance effects that would prevent him from successfully interfacing with the device's combined technological and supernatural systems. His vampire nature gave him the strength to survive the initial energy surge, but the interrupted binding ceremony had left Sarah as the only person present who could serve as a bridge between the human technology and supernatural forces that Victor's weapon had fused together. Adrian's frustration at being unable to protect Sarah by taking her place was compounded by his recognition that her sacrifice might complete their interrupted bond in ways that would save her life, even as it put her at maximum risk during the critical moments of energy absorption. Sarah's sacrifice required her to position herself at the exact center of the device's energy discharge pattern while using her medical knowledge to regulate her own physiology in ways that would allow her partially transformed biology to channel the mystical forces safely away from the hospital's structure and the hundreds of patients and staff members who would die if Victor's plan succeeded. The process felt like being struck by lightning while simultaneously performing surgery on herself, as she had to maintain conscious control over her enhanced but unstable abilities, while energies that could have powered a small city flowed through her nervous system and cellular structure. Her incomplete transformation actually proved advantageous during the absorption process, as her hybrid human-supernatural physiology created pathways for energy flow that neither fully human nor fully vampire biology could have accommodated without immediately fatal results. The transformation that Sarah underwent during her absorption of Victor's weapon's energy completed the binding ritual that had been interrupted weeks earlier, but under circumstances that enhanced and amplified the process far beyond what the original ceremony would have achieved under controlled conditions. The massive energy surge burned away the instabilities that had been threatening her life since the interrupted ritual, while simultaneously strengthening her connections to both human and supernatural aspects of her identity in ways that made her more powerful than either species typically achieved individually. Her enhanced abilities stabilized at levels that would allow her to serve as a permanent bridge between worlds, possessing supernatural strength and longevity while retaining the human compassion and medical knowledge that had made her valuable to both communities. Victor's redemption began in the moments when he witnessed Sarah's willingness to sacrifice her life to save everyone in the hospital, including the brother who had defeated him, and the supernatural parliament that had rejected his vision of vampire supremacy, as her actions demonstrated the kind of strength and nobility that he had claimed only vampires possessed, while proving that cooperation between species could produce results that neither could achieve alone. His decision to abandon his hatred and use ancient healing magic to stabilize Sarah's condition during the energy absorption process marked the first time in centuries that he had chosen to build rather than destroy, and his public support for Adrian's rule represented a fundamental shift in his understanding of what true power looked like when it was exercised with wisdom and restraint. The new alliance that emerged from Victor's change of heart transformed the political landscape of supernatural society, as his public endorsement of Adrian's integration policies carried enormous weight with conservative factions who had previously opposed cooperation with humans, based partly on Victor's arguments about vampire superiority and the dangers of revealing their existence. His acknowledgement that Sarah's sacrifice had proven human worthiness in ways that centuries of hidden predation had failed to demonstrate provided ideological cover for vampires who wanted to support integration but had been afraid to oppose traditional isolationist policies. The alliance between the brothers created unprecedented unity within vampire society, while also demonstrating to other supernatural species that even fundamental philosophical differences could be resolved through dialogue and shared experience rather than violence and political maneuvering. Community response to the events at St. Helena Medical Center exceeded everyone's expectations, as both human and supernatural populations found inspiration in Sarah and Adrian's example of cooperation under extreme circumstances, while Victor's redemption provided hope that even the deepest conflicts could be resolved through empathy and understanding rather than force. Human medical professionals began volunteering to work with supernatural patients, while supernatural beings started coming forward to offer their unique abilities in service of human medical research and treatment. The hospital became a symbol of what was possible when both species chose to focus on their shared values rather than their biological differences, and the integration model that had begun as Adrian's political vision became a practical reality that attracted supporters from across North America. Marcus's transition from security guard to the first human diplomat accredited to supernatural governments represented both personal achievement and historical precedent, as his appointment formalized the role that humans could play in facilitating cooperation between species while also establishing protocols for future diplomatic relationships. His network of human protectors became the foundation for a formal organization that would train others to serve as bridges between communities, providing education and support for humans who found themselves involved with supernatural beings through personal relationships, professional obligations, or simple chance encounters. Dr. Elena Rivera, who replaced the disgraced Dr. Voss as head of neurology, embraced the opportunity to specialize in supernatural medicine and became instrumental in developing treatment protocols that could address the unique physiological needs of patients whose biology operated according to different rules than standard human anatomy. 6 months after the crisis that had nearly destroyed both St. Helena Medical Center and the hope of supernatural human integration, the hospital had been transformed into the first officially integrated medical facility where humans and supernatural beings received treatment side by side while working together as colleagues and partners in ways that would have been unimaginable before Sarah's sacrifice proved that cooperation was not only possible but mutually beneficial. Sarah's role as chief of supernatural medicine utilized her unique background and abilities to bridge both worlds in ways that no one else could replicate, as her combination of human medical training and supernatural physiology made her ideally suited to understand and treat conditions that affected both species. Adrian ruled vampire society with Sarah as his queen, implementing policies that encouraged gradual integration rather than the forced exposure that Victor had attempted, while also maintaining the security and traditions that conservative vampires needed to feel comfortable with the changes that were reshaping their world. Room 237 had been converted into a memorial and museum space that told the story of how two worlds had first truly met through the relationship between a dedicated nurse and the vampire king she had unknowingly cared for during his mystical imprisonment, serving as both historical record and inspiration for future generations who would inherit the integrated world that Sarah and Adrian were building together. Victor's redemption arc continued as he found purpose in serving as Adrian's advisor on traditional vampire law, using his extensive knowledge of conservative vampire culture to help implement changes in ways that respected historical precedents while moving steadily toward greater cooperation with human society. Marcus's position as head of human supernatural relations involved training programs that prepared others to serve as bridges between communities, sharing the knowledge and experience he had gained through years of protecting supernatural beings while working within human institutions. The integration process faced ongoing challenges from extremists in both communities who refused to accept cooperation as preferable to the traditional arrangements of secrecy and separation, providing Sarah and Adrian with conflicts that tested their commitment to peaceful coexistence, while also offering opportunities to demonstrate that their vision could adapt to opposition without abandoning its core principles of mutual respect and shared benefit. Sarah's research into supernatural physiology produced medical advances that benefited both species, as her unique position allowed her to identify commonalities and differences that led to treatments for conditions that had previously been considered incurable by either human medicine or supernatural healing methods. Her work attracted researchers from universities and supernatural communities alike, creating collaborative networks that advance scientific understanding while also building personal relationships that supported the broader integration effort. The personal growth that Sarah and Adrian experienced through their trials and eventual triumph revealed that their love story was fundamentally about service to others rather than simply romantic fulfillment, as they discovered that their strongest bonds were forged through their shared commitment to healing and protecting both communities rather than pursuing their individual desires. Sarah had found her true calling in a role that combined her medical expertise with her supernatural abilities in ways that allowed her to help patients that no one else could treat effectively, while Adrian learned to balance the responsibilities of kingship with his personal relationships in ways that made him a more effective leader and a better partner. Their final scene together took place in the same room where Sarah had once bathed an unconscious patient, but now she tended to supernatural beings while Adrian read to human children in the hospital's expanded pediatric ward, demonstrating that their vision of integration had become reality through practical daily cooperation rather than grand political gestures. The promise that their love story represented for both communities was that healing came not from medicine alone, but from compassion that transcended species boundaries, proving that understanding and empathy could overcome fear and prejudice, whether they existed between individuals or entire civilizations. The arrival of a new mysterious patient, a werewolf found in circumstances similar to Adrian's original condition, suggested that their work of building bridges between worlds would continue to present new challenges and opportunities for growth, while also indicating that other supernatural beings might need the same kind of care and protection that had saved Adrian's life and transformed Sarah's destiny. Their final image together, hands intertwined as they watched the sunrise through the hospital window, symbolized their embrace of a future where darkness and light coexisted in harmony rather than conflict, no longer hiding from revelation, but working openly to create a world where both species could thrive through cooperation rather than dominance or submission. The story's thematic resolution fulfilled the promise of its title by showing how the nurse who had unknowingly cared for the vampire king became his equal partner in building a better world for both their species, with their relationship serving as proof that love and understanding could overcome any obstacle when they were combined with courage, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to serving something greater than themselves.